So the heading for today is, the topic for today is making healthier church decisions every day, training leaders to be natural church developers. And behind this idea starts with a statement that many of you would be very familiar with from the NCD world. And if you've done any degree of NCD coaching, you've no doubt many times made this statement to the people you're working with. NCD is a process, not a program. And this is absolutely true. This is not a one-off event or a program that we engage in NCD. It is, in fact, a process. Yes, we all know that. But one of the big challenges we have within NCD is that we try to help churches to do it in the context of the incredible busyness of church life. And so we hope that they'll understand that it's a principle-based process, that it's something to engage in consistently throughout the year. But the reality is, for most churches, they are busy with many activities, and then suddenly someone is asking them to do a survey. So there's some kind of an event happening, doing a survey, and then shortly afterwards they may be part of looking at results from that survey. And because there's often a certain degree of emotion and engagement and challenge, maybe sometimes some celebration attached to that, it can have very much a sense of being a program from the perspective of the people in the church or the leaders within the church, because it's you move through most of the year and then suddenly there's this event that relates to looking at the health of the church, and then following that, spending some time trying to determine what to do about those results. But then the busyness of church life moves back into the picture. Much must be done. There are many patterns and rhythms to church life that the leaders and rest of the congregation moves back into. And so maintaining the picture of NCD as a process in church life is very, very challenging. We've done much work over time to try to increase the extent to which there is a sense of process with NCD. And one of the things within that is introducing the NCD cycle. So we help people to understand they're in different phases of the NCD cycle. They continue through that, so we encourage them in that way. We have tools like NCD cycle starters, which are action steps that ideally they can begin working on and continue to cycle that through and make progress through the course of the year. And many of you that may be involved in NCD coaching perhaps have various approaches where you connect with the churches on a somewhat regular basis, have conversations, check on how they're going, ask them some coaching questions, and try to keep that process moving through. But even with all of that, there's a lot of gaps in between those meetings and exercises whereby the process is inclined to cease, or at least fall out of the minds of people. So it becomes quite a stop-start process along the way. So one of the questions that we're needing to ask ourselves is, how do we help leaders to not just do NCD, but to become natural church developers? So many people will speak of, oh yes, we have done NCD, or even we are doing NCD. But ultimately, if the church is people, then for people to be engaged in the NCD process, leaders, starting with leaders, have to become natural church developers in the everyday, so that the way that they make decisions, the actions they take, are more and more consistent with the kind of people who would naturally develop a church on a consistent basis. And despite the fact that over the years we've seen very good progress in NCD, we see churches on average after a couple of surveys making 6 points progress. We see growth rates moving in the right direction. That's all very encouraging. But clearly we have a long way to go still to come to the point where the natural rhythm in the everyday of becoming a natural church developer becomes the norm for leaders. And what that means is the potential to see dramatically more progress, much quicker progress, and much more consistent progress in the churches we work with is still one of the goals to pursue, and something that we've got a lot more work to do on. And certainly today's webinar is intending to aim very much towards that, to take a very large step forward in that process. So if I flesh this out a little bit further, let's just imagine a scenario. A church you're working with, or maybe belong to, or have some connection with, has taken an NCD survey some months ago, and they're working on their results. And over the next 6 months, they're going to hopefully take some action that will improve their results before, say, in November, they repeat the survey. So we take a status check up to this point now. So we're coming into June, and we're going to move through to November. And what will happen is that there will be thousands of daily decisions made, thousands of daily either life-releasing decisions or life-restricting decisions made by the leaders of these churches. Now, making this step to understanding NCD in the everyday requires leaders to move from the idea that NCD is something they do on the side and they know it's important and it kind of sits in the background of church life, to the point where this very week, by this weekend, they will have made decisions that have either increased or decreased the health of their church. And there is absolutely no escaping that. Every single decision those leaders make, no matter how small or large, will either be adding to or detracting from the health of the church. And I find Jesus' words very helpful here, particularly when he referred to or responded to the challenge about what he was doing on the Sabbath. And the question was, he raised the question, is the Sabbath a day for doing good or for doing evil? And I believe a major point in what he's saying is that as human beings, you're never in neutral. You're going to be improving things, making things better, or you're going to be making them worse. You're going to be doing good, or you're going to be doing evil. And so by the end of this week, the health of every church you're connected with or that we work with will either be a little bit stronger or a little bit weaker on the back of the decisions being made in the everyday. So to help leaders through to that point is a part of our goal, and to be much more sensitive that they are, in fact, either becoming or becoming better at or becoming worse at being natural church developers today and tomorrow and the next day. And that consciousness is what we want to help them to realize. So in our sample church, we say they've come through to June. We're starting off in June, and this is in the background. This is what their health looks like approximately. So need-oriented evangelism is their current greatest strength. They've got a great sense of outreach. The front door of church life is nicely open. They're reaching out into the community and trying to connect with people. But what their main challenges in the background are in more relational areas, like loving relationships, like holistic small groups. And so we could say that the front door is wide open, but also the back door appears to be somewhat open, because once those people come into the church, the challenge is how are we going to hold on to them and not see them drift out the back door of the church. So they're aware of this, they've looked at this, and they've even accepted the results. Yeah, that's reasonable, we need to do something about this. But they've reached June, and this is where the current status is. So they move through the course of June with much busyness going on in church life, and they're making decisions every day. They are impacting the health of their church every day. Even if they're not thinking about their NCD results, the health of their church is changing on the basis of their influence and decisions every day. So through the course of June, loving relationships has gone up just a little bit, maybe only because there's a little bit more awareness in the background that it needs to be addressed, or maybe even a little bit by accident. It simply has improved a fraction. And then the pastor remembers, oh, okay, we've got Easter out of the way, and we had Mother's Day out of the way, and the church camp out of the way, and we're now going to bring a bit more focus to that minimum factor thing, loving relationships. So he says, oh, I had planned to do a 4-week sermon series on loving relationships. So the pastor does that series through that month. All the while, at the same time, lots and lots of decisions are being made in the background. Interestingly enough, loving relationships starts to go down a little bit, and inspiring worship goes down a little bit, because the pastor was preaching about loving relationships but never told anyone why. And so they don't really like each other very much. Their loving relationships aren't very good as a result of that. And so the last thing they want to hear about is a series of 4 weeks sermons about loving relationships. And then they realize, well, okay, maybe we should start explaining why we are addressing this. And some of the leaders say, gee, I wonder if we just started to show a bit more love towards a few people in the church. Maybe I should say hello to a couple of people I don't normally speak to and be a little bit more encouraging. You know, at least let's try doing that. So through the month of August then, we see in the background the loving relationships start to move upwards a little bit. Influenced by the actions and decisions of those leaders. Well, this continues on because people are getting a little bit of a feeling like, I think this is working. I think being deliberate as a leader about loving people a little bit more seems to be rubbing off. So I'll keep doing that. And at the same time, I might share that insight with a few of the small group leaders. And lo and behold, through the month of September, in the background, loving relationships is just improving a little bit, as well as holistic small groups is improving, because the small group leaders are allowing a bit more time for for people to share about their feelings and problems and how they are about life. So this just continues on a bit further through the month of October, and there is a little bit of a warming of the atmosphere. And then eventually it hits November. The decision was made before, we're going to do a New End City survey. They take the survey, and while the health has been constantly changing in the background on the basis of all of those decisions, when they take the survey, they take a snapshot of that health in time, and they say, yay, that's wonderful. We've worked on loving relationships and it's improved by 3 points over the year. That's very encouraging. Now, we would encourage such a church. We do encourage such churches and say, that's great, you're making progress. But when you look at this against the backdrop of thousands and thousands and thousands of decisions being made through the course of the year before that, and then you've got 3 points improvement, probably based on only a handful of decisions that were actually made, where there was some intention about improving loving relationships, then it's reasonable to say, my goodness, we could hope for and expect considerably more progress than this if there was the understanding that that the leaders, at the very least, need to be developing the health of the church in the everyday through their decisions. So this, what we're looking at here, is a typical picture. It's worth encouraging, but at the same time points to us that there is a lot more that we could be expecting if we can help people become natural church developers. So what we're really talking about here is the issue of decision making and how many decisions are made by leaders, and the importance of helping them and training them to make healthier church decisions in the everyday. So if we break down the kind of decisions that are made, and let's look at a couple of approaches and the results of decisions made by leaders within churches. So the first example we'll look at is we have a leadership group, and they've got a bunch of resources that they are responsible for stewarding. And that's a large part of what a leadership team in a church has to do. They've got people's talent, they've got some money, they've got the church facilities and various opportunities, all these sorts of things. They meet together and hopefully make some good decisions in order to bring about some fruitful results and, hopefully see the kingdom come in some larger way. So in certain instances, a leadership team or individual leaders in a church will tend to take what I'd call rigid decisions. So they have certain fallback patterns and habits in the way they make decisions. They just they tend to always decide a certain thing, or they often say, well, that's just the way we do things around here, or that's our model of ministry, and anything that doesn't fit in with that really kind of falls outside. So when you have rigid decisions that are not fully looking at what God has blessed the church with, then the effect is something like this. Some of those resources a channel towards something fruitful, but a lot of the resources are just shot out sideways. So if you have people that have kind of creative ideas that don't quite fit in with the church, well, those people themselves might end up ejected out of the church. And there'll be lots of other resource and opportunity that such a group is not even able to make use of. And so there is a lot of resource that's lost. And the end result in such an environment is a drift towards what I'd call lifeless order, because over time you kill off the fresh life and possibilities that are presented there, because you're very closed and rigid in the way that decisions are being made. There's only certain ways that we approach things. As long as you give us some, put some money in the offering plate, and if you're willing to work in these specific ministries we have in the church, then we're happy to, make use of those people. But if it's outside of that, we really don't know what to do with it. We're not that interested in making use of it either. So that's one challenging approach to daily decision making, if it's just simply too rigid. On the other side, we can take exactly the same resources available to that given church right now, and then we face the problem not of rigid decisions, but of simply of indecision, whereby there is plenty of opportunity and potential that's available, but for the want of someone actually making some decisions, it simply doesn't get used. So things are put in the too hard basket, or we say we're just not sure if that's a safe thing to do, so we're just putting off that decision for now, and in effect deciding to go nowhere in particular. Now the problem is that when you have resources, particularly if they're living resources like people and like the gifts and talents and experiences and stories and everything that makes up the life of the church, it won't just sit in a box. So if you don't make decisions, there will be side effects anyway. Things will happen, and they won't happen very well. So if you're not making any decisions at all, then those resources will sort of spray out in different directions, will be lost here and lost there. And the end result, if you're not making any decisions, is the church will just drift into some kind of unstructured chaos. It'll just gradually wander here and wander there, and sometimes just simply start falling apart. Now, truth be told, there's no churches or individual leaders that make always rigid decisions or always are struck with indecision. Most, especially if they're unhealthy churches or leaders that aren't making healthy church decisions, most of the time it'll be a bit of a mixture of both. Sometimes there'll be rigid decisions where people just default to, this is just the way that I do things, or this is the way we do things. And other times it's just indecision and some sort of chaos. And so neither is making the best use of the resources available, and neither is moving the church towards better levels of health. So what's the alternative? Well, if we instead take exactly the same set of resources, and this is an important point as well, that we have to believe, if we're working with a church or part of a church, that God has given the resources necessary to take the next step forward. If we don't believe that, then we've got to really spend some solid personal time with God on that, because if we think that He's calling us to do great things in the world, but hasn't given us what we need for the next steps of doing that, then we really have to look at what our view of God is and reconsider those things. But if we instead understand and embrace the idea that, yes, God has given us whatever we need for the next steps, maybe not for what we need in 5 years' time, but what we need right now to move forward, to become healthier, to be more fruitful as a church. If we believe that, then we can be decisive and take some steps. So what kind of decisions are we looking for with that same box of resources, if you like? Well, what we're trying to find is a way forward to life-releasing decisions. And so just as this green curve, this green parabola in the picture here indicates, we're trying to harness all of the resources available towards life in all its fullness. Now, this is not just harnessing all the good things, all the happy people and the nice gifts and the money that's in the church or whatever else. This is also harnessing other things like the conflict or the challenges or the difficulties, and saying, how do we harness that and make use of that, turn that around for the sake of of life and all its fullness within the life of the church. And so this becomes really the main question. How do we increasingly train people so that their decision-making looks more like the picture on the right with the green parabola than the decision-making processes on the left with rigid decisions or indecision? And so in short, how do we train leaders to consistently make life-releasing decisions? All right, well, always good to refer to Jesus and consider what he suggested in these regards. And if you've been around NCD for a long period of time, know that the passage, learn from the lilies how they grow, they neither toil nor spin, is one of the key focal points within the natural part of natural church development, and then is a key part in the development of natural church developers, the people who are capable of growing churches in this way. And a critical part here is that many translations speak of see how the lilies grow, or looking at the lilies in some way. But what's lost in the background is that the original Greek term is an intensification of manthanos, which is to study, but then katamanthanos, which is rigorously study, almost like a scientific evaluation, almost to that point, how the lilies grow. So not just to feel good about the lilies, but to understand how they grow. And in the context of the overall passage, to do this is a way of understanding how God's kingdom is revealed and how it grows and how it functions. So if we want to make life-releasing decisions, then it's a good idea to look at God's creation and to understand how the lilies of the field grow, and to see what principles can be drawn from that to help us understand the way we should be making decisions to come in line with the way that God does everything else. So one of the main points that we can identify when we look at healthy living things in creation is that healthy living things make the best possible use of all that is available to them in accordance with the growth forces found in creation, accordance with the principles that we find in creation. So exactly the same thing can be said of very healthy churches. They make the best use possible of all that is available to them in accordance with the principles, the way that life functions in God's creation. Now, just to get a bit icky and take the exact opposite picture here, let's imagine a person who is very unhealthy. They have a digestive sickness. They have a stomach bug of some description. Well, what happens if you make available to that person food or drink that would otherwise be useful for them? Well, they will vomit that food back out again. And that's one of the characteristics of unhealthy things, is that they're unable to digest what they have available to them. And sadly, this is exactly what an unhealthy church looks like, is that it has a tendency to spew people out, to spew resources out. It's unable to make use of them. Here's some new people. We're not quite sure what to do with them. They're a bit different to us. Or here's some gifts that we're less familiar with, spiritual gifts we're less familiar with. We don't know what to do with them. And so we end up rejecting them. And those people end up leaving the church. Whereas a healthy church is able to make use of all the different diverse gifts and different people, and people with different cultural backgrounds. It's able to draw them in and help them to become part of the body, and help and for those people to be part in seeing the church become healthy and flourish. So what we're looking for in trying to train people to be healthy church developers in the everyday is to help them to understand what these principles are, and to help them to make decisions on that basis. So in one sense, we're looking to do nothing much more than what this very famous picture from within NCD is telling us. We're saying, how do you help them make decisions every day that would take the round wheels, the usable resources of the church, and put them on the cart to make the whole thing more natural? Now, this picture is a nice simple illustration of what NCD is about and what we're trying to help people to do through NCD. But it does, of course, as a simplification always does, it does mask the complexities of what's really involved here, because some of those round wheels, well, they might need a little bit of repair. Some of them might even need a little bit of oiling. Some may have been broken from before. And all these same things apply to people. We've got people who are like round wheels, but maybe they're a little bit broken, and maybe they're a little bit wobbly, or maybe they need some repair or need some oiling in some way. No matter what, they'll be better than having square wheels. But there are a lot of decisions that we'll have to make in order to make use of all that God has actually given us within the life of the church. And these are not necessarily easy decisions. They're not necessarily decisions that we want to be making, because sometimes it challenges the way we've done things before, just like these guys have been, very used to pulling the cart with square wheels. And in a strange way, they almost prefer that because it's familiar. And so there are many barriers that get in the way from making those kinds of decisions. But the largest barrier of all in the first place is simply the ability to see what God has actually given us and blessed us with in the context of a church. So as a coach, you may walk into some churches and just by looking around, you can see potential in different places, and you can see resources that are available for that church that the leaders or others simply can't see, that they're just not used to seeing it at all. But you may be able to see that. So how do we help them even notice what they've got? Because once you see what you've got, you've at least then got a chance of making use of that. So what I'd like to do just for a number of minutes is press a magic button on the Zoom meeting to get everyone to go into a small breakout room of 3 or 4 people, just to discuss this question, or to share this point, to share where you have seen a church improve its health by discovering and making better use of what God had already given them. So you may have examples of this. You can bring this to mind in specific ways. So I'd just like you to have a few minutes to be able to share your response to this topic that relates to seeing what God has provided. All right. So I hope you found that brief discussion helpful to some extent, and perhaps even encouraging in some of the creative ways and creative resources that churches become aware of that were right under their noses, so to speak, but they perhaps hadn't been harnessing until they really went looking for them. So in the background, what we're really looking at here is the topic of stewardship, and to a very large extent, NCD, at least the part of NCD that relates to what we humanly are meant to do. So NCD is about the natural partnership with God in growing the church. So as Paul said, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. It very much points to this relationship. But on the human side, stewardship is really very much at the absolute heart of what we are to do in order to play our part in developing the church. And so my own sort of working definition, if you like, of stewardship, or specifically good stewardship, is everyday life-releasing decisions that make best use of all the time, treasure, and talent available. Now, this theme of time, treasure, and talent has been around the church for quite some period of time. And in that respect, there's sometimes a sense that it might be a little bit tired, or because, at least in English, it starts with 3 T's, some have the concern that it's a little bit forced in some way and maybe not adequately representative. Having worked with it for quite some number of years and researched it from various different angles, I can only say how impressed, how astonished I am with those who began using that terminology in terms of how holistic it ends up being when each of those categories is fully understood and fully explored. And there really is a lot that goes a lot you can find going into the backgrounds of these things. So if we take the overall picture of time, treasure, and talent stewardship, the first thing that's quite interesting is that each of these forms of resources have a specific nuance about them in terms of the usage of that resource. So when it comes to time, it is the one of these three that will always be spent. You simply cannot help but use up time. As long as you're alive on this planet, you will be using time. And so it's a specific nuance that relates to time itself. When it comes to treasure, we can understand that as any form of resource that can be used up or worn out. And so that's a specifically unique part about treasure. And so that it's a key to work out how to conserve that treasure, given that it can be used up or worn out. When it comes to talent, the specific nuance in that corner is that talent is anything that you are able to use or give away, but at the same time, you don't lose it in the process of using it or giving it away. So if you teach someone else how to do something that you know how to do, you don't lose the ability to do that. If you share information with someone that is helpful to them, you don't lose that information in the process of sharing it. And so there is this specific nuance about each of these different areas that in itself is quite fascinating, but it helps us to take the first step in understanding the way that people approach resources, the kinds of things that they tend to have blind spots towards and the kinds of things that they can see much more clearly. And in this process of research into these categories, in the stewardship paradigm of NCD and the stewardship test itself, we then look at the topic of the 6 life-releasing growth forces within creation. So this is answering the question of what is it when you go and study how the lilies of the field grow? What will you discover in that process? Well, there's many things you'll discover, but at the most abstracted, distilled level, at the kind of deepest level in a sense, there are 6 of these life-releasing growth forces that can be identified right throughout creation. Where life is healthy and flourishing, these principles are coming to bear. Now, it may be interesting for some to know that we're familiar with the 8 quality characteristics within NCD, but the 6 growth forces spoken of in NCD actually predate the quality characteristics. So they'd become apparent to Christian Schwartz prior to the 8 quality characteristics being distilled and fully understood. So there's a very long history with these growth forces in the context of NCD. And of course, they are the natural principles that put the N in NCD, because ultimately the unforced nature and pursuit of NCD ties back to these life-releasing growth forces. And so when we consider what stewardship means, making best use of all that God has given us in healthy churches, then it makes sense for us to look at each of these principles. And what's another point became fascinating and quite a breakthrough point in exploration of these principles in the context of stewardship was that they each have certain strong affinities to time, treasure, or talent, or the spaces between those, or the overlap areas between them. So in the case, the principle of interdependence essentially says that everything in the world is interconnected. And it's important that we, as much as humanly possible, come to understand those interconnections between things, because that will help us to understand what we can learn from history, because everything that's happened in the world to this point has helped lead towards your life at this very moment. And there's this enormous connectedness. But then moving forwards, every action we take will have knock-on consequences that rattle outwards in all sorts of different directions. And so understanding those connections is really at the heart of wisdom. And there's a huge component in terms of our good usage of time there, the good use of time historically to learn, to not have to relearn the countless lessons that have been learnt through history when things bang up against each other or work cooperatively together. We learn that through interdependence. But in the same time, moving forwards, it's critically important to recognize those consequences of our actions so that we don't end up having to fix things up in the future, or having to spend lots of time dealing with problems that were created now where we really didn't think through the consequences. So interdependence has a huge connection with time. The second principle we look at here is sustainability. The very term sustainability immediately infers that it's possible for things to not be sustained. So immediately we're looking at the kinds of resources that can run out and that we would have to be concerned about sustaining them. And so this is in a broad category of the treasure area, any of these things that can be used up or worn out. So that's the principal concern behind that is that of sustainability, keeping things going. And then we look across at the principle of multiplication, which has an enormous affinity with the area of talent. We can think of talent and saying, what's the best thing you could do with talent? Well, you should use talent. Yes, that's a very important thing to do with talent. But the most powerful thing you can do with talent is to multiply it. You could spend your whole life using your talent directly, or you could spend a large amount of your life passing on your talent to other people. And in that multiplication, the impact of what you do in this world will be dramatically larger as a result of that. So again, these three principles are clearly found strewn right through creation in so many different places. And only in as much as we bring them into the life of the church will we see it become more natural. And then we have the other three growth forces, all equally important, well, six equally important: symbiosis, fruitfulness, and energy transformation. And each of these have very strong affinities with the recognition and usage of either time, treasure, talent, or a combination of them. So, for example, symbiosis is the mutual working together, mutually beneficial working together of living things. So you can think of sharks and pilot fish living in a symbiotic relationship with each other, where the pilot fish eat the parasites off the shark, and the shark provides food and some protection for the pilot fish. And there's countless examples of symbiosis right through creation that we could explore. The symbiosis, what's fascinating is that when you symbiotically or collaboratively connect with another person, you are drawing upon the experiences of the time of their life and the talent of their life, and drawing upon that. And that is then coming into your own life as a benefit, just as all the time and talent experiences right through your own life are hopefully then feeding in and benefiting the other person. So there are very strong affinities in each of these areas. And this was really one of the huge breakthrough points. It was an exciting sort of period to be able to share some of these thoughts with Christian about the way these things fit together, and have direct connections in unique ways with the theme of stewardship, or the cart with the square wheels idea of what we pursue. Now, to link all this in with daily decision making, and we want to press in here, the goal in all this discussion is really to get to a point where we have incredibly simple ways of helping leaders in the everyday become natural church developers. So, this is lots of background, but ultimately, this is not the most important stuff. The important thing is when we get to the point of having a very simple point that we can raise with any individual leader or leadership team that will help them to become better natural church developers. So a couple of questions, a couple of themes come out of this to help us connect this with daily decision making. So one is that every decision you ever make impacts your available time, treasure, and talent. There's simply no decision that you could make that doesn't have some connection or impact upon either losing time, treasure, or talent, or gaining in some way time, treasure, or talent. So there is an implication with every single decision that you make with those areas. And this important fact ties in with a question, and that is the question of what do we have to use? What do we have available to us to use? That's one important aspect of the decision-making process. You have to be aware of what you have in order to make a sensible decision about that resource. And there's the double meaning here. What do we have to use? What do we have available to use? But what must we use in the imperative of things like the parable of the talents, where Jesus depicts the master as as really very, very angry at the person who didn't make best use of what was given. And the amount given to each of those three in the story was an enormous amount provided there. And so that's really the first part of it. What do we have to use? And then on the other side, when we consider every decision that is made, every decision you ever make involves aims, timing, and responsibilities. And so in any decision you'll make today, there'll be some aim within that, some purpose, something you're pointing at. Otherwise, there'd really be no point in making the decision. There is some end that you're hoping to achieve, either to achieve something or to avoid something, but there's nevertheless an aim in that decision. And every decision you, church leaders or leadership groups will make will also have an element of timing to it. So if you don't do a good job of timing, you can have really good aims, but still mess things up and still end up in a really troubling situation. So timing is a critical part. But then you can have very clear aims and have really good timing, but you still have the issue of responsibilities. Who's going to do what? In simple decisions, you're having to recognize you have to take responsibility. In other instances, someone else has to take responsibility. In still other instances, you have to take responsibility to work together in order to make something happen. So every decision impacts upon time, treasure, and talent, and every decision involves aims, timing, and responsibilities. And in this second instance, we're going from what do we have to use, what do we have available to use, to how should we use it. There's these two critical components within decision making. Well, the 6 growth forces help answer these questions in an unforced, natural way. So if we're unsure of what to do, we don't have to randomly guess at it or just buy the latest best-selling Christian book and hope it has some clever ideas in it. We can be a little more specific than that and understand that whenever we have resources available, we will be able to see them better and use them better if we use them in accordance with the principles that God has baked in and makes use of, through the whole of creation. So let's sort of, again, keep drilling in to make this more and more practical. So if we consider that life-releasing decisions are basically about getting aims, timing, and responsibilities right, then we can start looking at these growth forces, and we then happen upon what was an even bigger and more exciting discovery in addressing this overall topic. And that is that these growth forces actually exist in complementary pairs that speak into exactly these topics of aims, timing, and responsibility. So in the case of fruitfulness and multiplication, we say, well, what do they have in common with each other? And the answer is that they both speak into the topic of aims. So in the context of fruitfulness, the aim in any given decision hopefully has something to do with better fruit, making something better. And that's a critical aim in any decision making. You should hope to be including some part that makes things better. On the other side, multiplication has the aim of having more trees. So you imagine that you might have better fruit, but if the trees eventually get old and die, you don't have any better fruit anymore. So you need more trees. But there's no point just having more trees unless the fruit the trees are bearing is actually better fruit. So both of these aims are contained within, or ideally contained in, any decision being made. So they're both critical, but at the same time, individual leaders and leadership groups will have tendencies when they aim at things that is one direction or the other. So for some groups, they're much more focused. Their decision-making default is all about better fruit. How do we measure things? How do we monitor things? How do we improve upon things and make them better and better? Well, of course, that's a very good thing. But if you do that and exclude the creative experimentation involved in growing more trees, eventually you'll just sterilize the whole church, the whole environment. You'll eventually kill everything because you're so obsessed with making everything so perfect that you eventually kill it off completely. And so it's important to hold that in balance then with the other side. But again, if you only focus on the other side, and some people are constantly creating new ministries and new ideas, or even planting lots of new churches and releasing. But if you start lots of things and you don't actually focus on whether they're bearing fruit or whether they're bearing better fruit, then you're just creating a lot of chaos and a lot of harm is being done over time. And it will take a lot to undo the damage that's done by that if you're not monitoring the fruit at the same time. So it's important in whatever aims are that you can see an element of both sides. We want to be making, growing more trees, so to speak, multiplying things, starting new things, giving things new life, and we need to be working on better fruit. So that's where the aims part comes into the picture. We then look at two of the other principles, interdependence and energy transformation. So what do these two principles have in common? Well, these have a very strong affinity with the theme of timing. In the case of interdependence, we have long-term timing, as I was referring to before. It's looking at the long span, learning from the interdependence of history, and then looking ahead into the future to make sure what we do today has positive consequences into the future. So there's a lot of reflection and there's a lot of anticipation that is involved in that. Very important in working out the best timing related to decisions. And then on the energy transformation side, we have the immediate side of timing. So yes, we must consider all the consequences, but we must ask ourselves, what must be done right now? What can be done right now? And we have to act upon it. And that's critically important. So again, if you take the two together, then we can say, yes, the timing is excellent timing because this leader or this group considers both aspects of timing. What must be done now and what's the long-term perspective as well. If they get it out of balance, and in an unhealthy church, it will probably be out of balance. If they focus much more on the long-term side, then the danger is that they potentially become quite paralyzed. They're so concerned about taking in every fact and considering every possible consequence that they never actually decide to do anything. They're too nervous to do that. So they're not considering what can we, at the very least, do right now. And so they're imbalanced in that way. But on the other side, if you have a group that is always much more focused in their decision-making on the immediate, and the feeling that we have to act now, we have to get busy right now, and the sense of, I'm not really, we're not really doing real ministry unless we're constantly active and working on different things, then that's going to be a problem because we're not considering what the long-term consequences are. We might achieve a few good things today, but what if those are undone by the negative consequences that flow on from that? And so, again, it's critical that both aspects of timing are being considered in the decision-making if we're going to be natural church developers. And then finally, of course, the last one is the pair of symbiosis and sustainability have a very strong affinity with the aspect of responsibilities. Our third component in third pillar of decision-making and stewardship. So on the sustainability side, we have the area of allocation. So if you're going to take responsibility for things, you're going to allocate responsibilities. You're going to allocate funds into a budget. You're going to make it clear what each person is doing, what funds are doing. You're going to set clear boundaries and make sure that responsibility is being taken in that way. But also, on the other side, in terms of symbiosis, we then have the responsibility for collaboration. And this is an often forgotten kind of idea that it's no good to simply think to ourselves, well, I'm not very good at that, so other people will take care of it. If the other people around you don't know they have the permission to actually take care of it, they might be afraid of stepping on your toes or getting in the way. And so it's important that we take responsibility, acknowledging what we can't achieve on our own, and therefore ask for help, connect with others, collaborate with others, and bring them in, melt our abilities together in order to fully take responsibility for all that must be done. Again, both sides are critical if we're going to take responsibilities seriously in decision making. On the one side, some people focus much more on allocation. They like setting clear boundaries around everything, making sure that everyone has their task to do, making sure that all the money is budgeted into little boxes. The problem with that is that you can end up in a situation where people and resources end up feeling a bit exploited or commodified, or people end up feeling like things because they're being given tasks and things are being separated out from them, but they are not feeling connected together. On the other side, you have the collaboration side. There are people who love to collaborate and get together and brainstorm and think through things and discuss topics and be creative in that way. The problem is if they don't also finish that gathering and then allocate what each person's actually going to do, then you have the danger of the whole thing starving to death. So it might be a great idea, but it simply has no sustainability. It doesn't go anywhere. So again, these two parts are absolutely critical when it comes to determining responsibilities. So in the stewardship test, what we have is, as part of the test, we have this kind of picture. Now, this happens to be my own results from the test. And what I can say very definitely is that only a year or two ago, they would have looked really quite different, because having the benefit of working on the research and the project allowed me to start to get to work on the areas that were pretty obviously problems for me that needed to be worked upon in the way I make decisions and the way I try to release life to try to make things happen. So you can see in responsibilities, I'm relatively balanced. I've got about a 4% imbalance, slightly more towards collaboration, a bit less towards allocation. Timing, again, around about a 4% imbalance, slightly more towards the long term, not quite as much towards the immediate, but much more than I used to be. I used to be much more focused on the long term and nowhere near as much on the immediate. And then in determining aims, this is my confession, no question, this is definitely the area that is the weakness for me. My own life, my family's life, my NCD Australia ministry, my NCD International ministry, they all suffer as a result of me being imbalanced in this regard. I'm certainly more focused on better fruit as opposed to more trees, and that does, it comes through in various different ways, but that's certainly what I'm working on now and seeking to grow in. So I'm in my decision making being much more conscious in many things through every day, little things I can do differently in order to encourage more trees to do a little bit more multiplication, to release things a bit more. And I'm told that I'm making progress. I'll soon see when I repeat the test and see whether I've actually gone anywhere. But this is in essence what any leader can then look at to get a feel for which of these three pillars is the strongest: responsibilities, timing, aims, and where within that is the main danger point. Where is the point that I'm not managing to be a natural church developer? And how can I become that to a greater extent? So the overall theme of this webinar has been making healthier church decisions every day, training leaders to be natural church developers. And so I want to bring this down now to the most practical level in terms of what can we do to make this as simple as possible so that it will actually happen in the everyday, and we can see that considerably higher progress that we would hope for, so that the principles entity are not just something addressed once a year, but are interwoven into the whole of church life and decision making. So obviously, I would say a very good idea is to get a leadership group to take the stewardship test. It's very quick, it's very inexpensive, it's very easy to facilitate. I'll give you the link at the end of the webinar, and you can click on that, and it says exactly the steps necessary to take the test. So take the test, and the first thing to find out is, well, which which resource do you tend to steward best? So this is my own result. So time, I make best use of time. Talent, not quite so much. Treasure in the middle. And then a range of other things are highlighted through the profile about the way I make decisions, the approach that I take, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are. And then it flows through ultimately to come to a single question that is most critical for me to be asking myself on a regular basis. And this is where we end up landing it. And so I want you to just picture this now as being 6 people who are maybe the leadership team of a church you're working with, might be the team you work with in your own ministry, could be your family, could be any particular group of people. And you want them to be able to make better use of their time, treasure, and talent. You want them to be able to move towards life in all its fullness. You want them to be able to see and make best use of all God has blessed them with. And in the context of a church, that ends up meaning they have a much healthier, much more fruitful church. And so these are just 6 people, and you can imagine whoever they are. I've got names on them. And so let's just have a look at what this means. So they've taken the test, and then this is what's going to happen moving forward. So the first one is Neil. Hello, Neil. Neil's excitable, bouncing on the page there. Now, in this context, we can say that the test has indicated, okay, Neil's best at timing. And this means that when it comes to decision-making, is really good at balancing the concerns for the long term and determining what should be done right now. So that's terrific. Timing's always going to be in a good place. Then we've got on the other side, the challenge is an imbalance in responsibilities. And specifically, so Neil is big on allocation, so very good at clarifying what he needs to do, what other people perhaps need to do, and that's very helpful for sustaining things. So in and of itself, that's good. The problem is that on the other side, a tendency to neglect collaboration. So when you need to come together to share strengths and work together to bring about something greater than what you can do individually. And so that's where the challenge comes into the picture. And then there's a danger in the background of all of that. The greatest danger is that of wasting time and talent. So even if there is some good use of time and talent, the test then indicates, well, there is so much more that could be done with the available time and talent around you. So what does the test end up saying? All right, well, this is the single page from the test to put on the wall and to ask every day, multiple times a day. Neil, who should you work alongside to make things better? Now, I must confess, and we have, I think Henrik Anderson is still in the meeting with us. In early stages, I talked with Henrik and he had some thoughts around the whole test. And I have never really been convinced about the thing you put on the wall. And, you know, it's a prompt and reminder, and some people like those things. I wasn't particularly convinced. I've had to completely repent of that because in the context of decision making, we all make so many decisions every day, far more than we have any awareness of. And if you are being prompted to ask a question that you rarely ask yourself, then suddenly every one of those decisions is slightly different. Even if it's only different by a few percent, you are starting to steer more and more towards life in all its fullness. You're starting to release more life. You're starting to make better use of the available resources God has blessed you with. And so, you know, I'm thoroughly sold on this approach, having worked with a number of people now who have done nothing much more than that. Put the sign on the wall, ask the question themselves, and have invited others to ask that question of them whenever it seems to be a good time to ask that question. And so that's essentially where it lands. Then we move on to the next person. So we have Tanya here, bouncing around on the screen. So best at responsibility. So interestingly, best at the very thing that Neil was not quite so good at. So great that they're on a team together. Responsibilities. So good at balancing allocation and collaboration. Those two essential sides in decision making. More imbalanced in timing. So that specifically comes up in terms of being very good in the long term, consideration of interdependence and the big picture in the long term of things, but not quite so good in terms of the immediate, what must be done right now. So that becomes the challenge in the decision making for Tanya. And then because of those tendencies, the greatest danger is that of wasting talent and treasure. So the question for Tanya to consider is, Tanya, what can you do right now with what you have? So again, this simple prompt being there in the background as many, many decisions are being made each day is just enough to prompt a little bit further to say, oh, there is something I can probably do right now. I'm considering the bigger picture, but there is something I can act on right now and make a difference immediately in the world around me, in my own life and in the lives of the people further beyond me. So we move to the next person, which happens to be me. So I found a bald silhouette that seemed to be appropriate. A very similar haircut to you, Alex. Yes, so again, as you saw before, responsibilities, that's the area that I'm doing best in at the moment. But again, aims is my most imbalanced area. So I'm big on better fruit. I tend to neglect the more trees, the multiplying of things, and I'm definitely in danger of wasting talent, wasting my own, potentially wasting that of other people. And that has become clearer and clearer to me. And on the other side of it, as I have this question on my refrigerator, I have it on my office wall, and as I ask it and as others ask me of it, the simple prompt, who must I give more power to, is enough to make a difference in decisions I do every day. Who should I be making a phone call to in order to empower them in some way? Who should I be connecting up with to see how they're going with something that I started them on some time back? Incredibly simple things where I'm multiplying into the life of another person. Very ordinary things like that. They're not particularly spectacular, but when you repeat them every day over and over and over, it amounts and mounts up very considerably. The next person we have here is Terry, and she is best at aims, more trees and better fruit. So she's best at aims, like Tanya was, I think. I can't remember who now. I've forgotten that, but more trees plus better fruit, but imbalanced in timing, but in the opposite way this time round. So she's very big on the immediate, frantically working on things, must be busy. Let's take action now. We can't wait. Why are we sitting around talking? Why are we reflecting on things? Why are we having so much discussion? We should just be acting right now. But then the danger is the neglect is the long-term perspective and considering, okay, what are the consequences of these things? Maybe we should wait a little. Maybe the timing would be better in an hour or a day's time or next week, and considering those sorts of things. So the greatest danger there is that of wasting time, which is ironic because for such a person, the feeling is often that they are making great use of time because they're very, very busy. But being very busy doesn't at all equal making best use of time, because if you're potentially generating more problems by the actions you're taking, then you may end up having to spend a lot more time in future catching up for the very things that you've been acting on today. So the question for Terry is, are you aware of the side effects of your actions? And a number of my friends have this question, and what it simply seems to do is, if it causes you to pause for even a few seconds before taking an action and thinking, well, I wonder, oh, actually that might happen if I take this action. Well, I should just adjust my decision slightly and it will have better side effects. But just that moment of pause can have an incredible effect, giving a few extra minutes just to consider those things. Next person. Louisa, best at responsibilities, so really good at balancing the allocation and collaboration, not so good at aims, same as myself, but the opposite tendency to myself. So Louisa's very strong on starting new things, releasing people to try things, and sharing stories and inspiring people to have a go and explore possibilities, but really not very good at all on monitoring the fruitfulness of those activities. And so it's all very well to start them off, but if you don't come back and check, is it actually bearing fruit, then you could be creating all sorts of problems rather than actually solving things. And so in the process of all of that, there's the danger of wasting considerable time and treasure. And then the question for Louisa on the wall is, what end result are you actually achieving? So not just to be considering what am I starting right now, but what's the outcome? What's ending up coming out of the very things that I'm trying to do? And am I clear on that? Do I even know what I'm aiming for? Do I know what is happening as a result of my activity? And then the last example here, so these will represent all of the six potential outcomes from the test. So we've got Bill, best at aims, really good at balancing the more trees, better fruit thing, and but imbalanced in responsibilities. Loves to collaborate, loves to get together with other people and workshop things and try things out and experiment and creative ideas and brainstorming. Fabulous at that side of things. But not so good at then allocating the tasks and responsibilities and determining who should be doing what as a result of that. And so that then brings about a danger of things not being sustainable as a result. And so the greatest danger is that of wasting treasure at the end of the day. So the question for Bill then becomes, Bill, how will you keep that going? So that's the sign on the wall. So each of these people are living daily life, whether they're church leaders, like in their church leadership capacity, or just in daily life, in their business capacity, whatever part of their world, in their home life, and consistently being asked this question or asking it of themselves, and then adjusting their decisions on the basis of what their response is to that question that they don't usually ask themselves. And so that's happening at an individual level. But then, of course, what you can do is you can then produce a group profile based on this leadership team and find out what is the collective result saying. So unfortunately, in this team, my influence was a little bit too high and the overall average tendency lent towards my own danger. So the question is, team, who must we give more power to? So wherever the team meets, that's on the wall, and that's being asked on a regular basis. In every discussion, it's being referred to and saying, okay, who must we give more power to? We go, oh, well, we almost made that decision, but really we should change it slightly because that's not really giving more power to such and such and such and such. So that then holds that to account. So you've got the individual level and you've got the team level, constantly adjusting this and helping these people to become natural church developers in the everyday, constantly influencing the health of their church in a more positive way, interwoven in those thousands and thousands of decisions that they're making through each week and right throughout the year. Just briefly, my experiences so far with the stewardship test, some example scenarios. So obviously, as I say, I take my own profile very, very seriously in working on that, and been very encouraged by the signs of new life emerging around me from adjusting the way I'm making decisions. My wife's and my children's profiles, you can't see it from here, but my refrigerator is over there and it's got all of our questions on the fridge. So when we sit at the dinner table, it's very common for someone to ask someone else's question, because my children will be like that, more than happy to hold each other accountable for their growth areas. But again, just even from a young age, asking those questions and seeing how they adjust their decision making by thinking about the things they don't usually think about when making decisions. Married couples have had some quite moving experiences helping some married couples, which I never really anticipated would be part of a stewardship process. But when you think of how many decisions a married couple have to make together and how often there's the potential for conflict, when they start to understand the reasons the other person makes the decisions they do, and then starts to understand how to make better decisions, it's remarkable how that can help them relationally, which would also apply to business partners or anyone working together in life. We've got an Oikos household gardeners group with our neighbours, and we've done a whole team profile on that, which is quite fun because we're working in the organic created world, and considering the way we make decisions there and how we can get better at working together, growing our vegetables and fruit and various things that we do. A friend I'm working with who has his own small business and working out how to make better decisions in that context so that that small business can be a beacon for in the kingdom of God. And of course, our main theme has been in the context of church leadership teams, which I'm very keen to continue to move more and more into and gain greater experiences in that area. So basically, if you're keen to explore this further, head to threecolorsofstewardship.life. The options are there, the suggestions are there, how to do it with a team is there. There's also a whole lot of very specific suggestions as well. If people want to go even more detailed with their results, not just the one-page question, if they want more suggestions and ideas about how to grow in their decision-making, whole pile of suggestions there as well. But the other thing as well is, if you are exploring this further with a team or a group and you're wanting to, just experiment a bit more with it, I'd love to hear from you. And if it's ever useful to meet up and have a Zoom meeting together and talk it through and chat about results or ideas, I'm very keen to collaboratively work with people on this, because I learn so much from the experiences others are gaining, and I can share thoughts about how it's being used and suggestions to do with the processes. So would love to be in contact if you'd like to connect in that way. So yeah, basically that's the overall picture from today's webinar, but I'm interested just now to hear any thoughts or questions people may have. Generally find it the easiest thing with people's different microphones is if you are able to simply type your question or your thought or comment or whatever it happens to be into the chat window, and then I can respond to it as they come through there. So please fire away. Am I ready to translate the tool into Spanish? I'd love to translate the tool into Spanish. I actually translated into Russian last week, which was quite fun. So yeah, please drop me an email, and I have translation templates and things to be able to work that into other languages. Thank you. Some kind comments there. Appreciate that. That's lovely. Yes, a question about the recording. Yes, the recording will be uploaded tomorrow, and that will be available on the coach page on the Ann City Church Survey website, along with the presentation as well. I'll upload the presentation so you can make use of the slides from that as well. Stewardship test focus to improve on one's weaknesses versus a strengths-based approach. Yes, certainly. I mean, we're always wanting to validate people's strengths and in case they're not aware of what their strengths are, but at the same time, certainly working on how they can make better decisions. Yes, I'll send the presentation through. Yeah, some other kind comments. It's good to know. It's making sense. I've done a lot of work for it's almost 20 years now, working on the growth forces in some way, trying to work out how to make them more practical. So some of these recent breakthroughs have been incredibly exciting because they are so abstract at one level, but people tend to know they're important. They think, yes, these things seem to be important, but what on earth do we do with them? So to bring it into the context of everyday stewardship and everyday decision making is hopefully going to allow us to really see them used much more. Yeah, so a question from Neil. So you don't have to think of a specific context when you take the test, example, church, business, etc. Yeah, ideally not. Ideally, you answer it in a generalized way because you're wanting to work out how you adjust your decision making in all contexts, whether you're at home, at work, in any different place. How do we access the coach page? if you could send me an email, Susan, that would be great, and I'll just send you the link through for that. Lovely. Okay. If there's no other questions or comments there, as I say, would love to hear from any of you if you want to connect up and chat a little bit more. Oh, sorry, another question there. What do you do with the coach page? So, Alex, we can connect you to the coach page. So again, if you could just drop me an email. So the coach page has all of the previous webinars on it, and has other suggestions in terms of how to develop coaching as well. Henrik, right. My plane has just been delayed for an hour. Could you keep going? No, it's 3:30 in the morning in Brisbane. I think I should probably have some sleep soon. So thank you all for tuning in today. I'd just like to pray with you all now and look forward to any chances to connect with you further on this topic or other topics into the future. Yeah, Jesus, we thank you that you have entrusted us with just so very, very much. And you've blessed us with abundant resources, and most of which we don't even have the eyes to see yet. And as we think of our own stewardship and our own modeling of these principles, I pray you will help us to be consistent and diligent in learning to steward the way you would have us do so. And as we consider working with the churches that we engage with, I just pray that you will give us a larger vision of what is possible in terms of progress in church health. We have good reason to be encouraged through the NCD ministry, but there is so much more that could happen. You know, we have your Spirit and powering this whole enterprise, and that tells us that there must certainly be plenty more barriers that we can still remove to see much greater fruitfulness. So, yeah, we just pray that you would take these tools and our offerings and multiply them in greater measure, that we may be good stewards of all you have given us in terms of our responsibilities in your kingdom, and that we may see much greater fruit from the work that we put in, and that would all bring glory to you, and that people would see you much more clearly than they do now. We love you, Jesus, and yeah, I just thank you for the lives of all the people connected into this meeting today. We pray all this in your name and for your sake. Amen. Thank you, everyone. And it's good morning and good night.